I've been making a massive mistake in Wuthering Waves since day one. For the first 6 months, I thought this game had no deep lore, and only once Rinacita dropped did I think it started picking up. But oh, how wrong I was. This game had deep lore since day one, and it's been staring me in the face the whole time. So let's get to the root of this deep lore problem. That's right, roots. Let's check them out.
Time to get back to work.
When I started Wuthering Waves back at launch, I thought there wasn't much deep lore, which is personally a big draw of these open world games for me. Deep lore, or hidden pieces and patterns in the lore, give a subset of players something to latch onto and make theories. It's like a giant ever-evolving puzzle as we are given more pieces to build on. With Rinacita's launch, as well as the second playthrough I started recently, I found that perhaps the lore is rooted deeper than I first thought. For instance, this video will be focused on trees and roots, aspects of the background that are often overlooked, but may be more important than one might initially think. In fact, it might be what both bridges the gap and separates our world from the netherworld, and by extension, untold underground galaxies, or so as quoted from a crazy CSC scientist. So, what does this crazy theory entail, and what evidence aligned that led me to this conclusion? First, let's start with Section 1. Roots reinforce Sol 3's surface. Running through Jinzhou on launch day, there were a ton of visible roots scattered throughout the world. None more apparent than those in the area leading up to the Great Banyan tree. I thought nothing of this other than it was a cool aesthetic. I continued to think nothing about it until I played Ling Yang's first companion quest on a second playthrough, more than a year into the game. Entering the cave for this companion quest, my eyes were open to just how massive the underground could be, and how many massive trees there were in this underground system. This forced me to reconsider the roots' place in this world. They may be more than just a backdrop. However, in Jinzhou there wasn't really much available to begin to formulate a solid theory. 2 factors are necessary to formulate theories. 1, consistency, and 2, divergence from established pattern, specifically only when a new variable is introduced. Both factors are necessary to define and test a theory. Jinzhou had decent consistency. However, there was nothing to compare to. Hence why they blended into the background during my first playthrough. They were just a consistent, unchanging presence throughout Jinzhou, with the only small difference being their absence in areas touched by heavy wave-worn phenomenon, such as the port city of Guishu and the suspended ruins. However, a clear cause and effect was difficult to prove here because the petrified trees in these areas were not the same size or shape of the roots seen elsewhere. Then came Rinacita in January of 2025, and with it, a new region to explore for roots. As we moved into Rinacita, something I noticed immediately was the apparent lack of roots. However, once I arrived at the Fugacia Peninsula, I found what I was looking for. This reduced number of roots in Rinacita is potentially expected if the roots stem from the massive trees of Solaris 3, where older trees would have larger root systems. The Great Banyan of Jinzhou is objectively older than the oak tree of the High Court. Not only is it much larger in size, but it has also had time to recover from whatever event obliterated its top half. This would allow more time for its root system to have taken hold and spread. Alternatively, it is possible that there are more trees in Jinzhou that contribute to this network, such as the Violet Banyan, and to a lesser extent the tree above the town in Xiaoyun Vale. In Rinacita, for comparison, I've not been able to find any smaller subsidiary oak trees besides those in the Fugacia Peninsula. Or inversely, if these trees are sprouting out of the roots by a propagation process known as root suckering, then one might expect older trees near more dense root colonies. A second point of this difference was that all the Rinacitan roots have a purple-blue light pulsing within them, which puzzled me for a long time, but we'll return to that in the next section. For now, why is this all important? Well, I hypothesize that the roots hold this layer of the world together. With the release of both Septimont and the Fabricatorium of the Deep, we see many more roots, of which are reminiscent of Jinzhou's supportive nature, seemingly reinforcing the earth like a natural rebar. They are the land itself. But what is there to support, and why? A brief comment from a CSC quest in the Winding Aches' Mire mentions an ultimate goal of the CSC was to find a gate to underground galaxies, something I found very intriguing and would suggest that the underground may be extensive. Perhaps whatever lies below us has its ceiling held up by these roots. The potential existence of extensive underground regions would make sense because during the first lament, humanity had to retreat underground for an extensive period of time. While this is just a loose thought now, perhaps the concentric circle motif we see throughout Solaris, on ancient floors and walls, are hinting at how the world is hollow with several layers, or I suppose shells, separated by a root system. Perhaps it is a healing response of the planet to repeated laments. Now, this theory is a work in progress, and we will need more evidence, perhaps a full underground region with extensive roots in the walls or ceilings. But until then, is there any additional evidence to support this theory? Maybe, but it's up to you to accept this next point as evidence or not, as it comes from the Somniore, dreaming deep. While dreams are not real and therefore may not be quote-unquote canon, they are a reflection of and help us process past experiences. Two events in the Dreaming Deep deal with trees. I will be referring to the Withered Tree event. In this exchange, we are called quote-unquote the Immortal by a tree in a poorly lit alleyway. Now, Rover is immortal, so that checks out that the tree is likely referring to us as Rover. On a subconscious level, the alleyway could represent the space between. Specifically here, the space between crusts or shells of this world. Now, these shells, like I had mentioned before, could be represented by the lifted portions of the concentric circle motif we see throughout the world. Rover takes the bow that it is given and attempts to plant it in the highest surface that is lit by natural light, the one that they currently inhabit. However, like the great banyan before it, this small tree did not manage to generate a new world tree for this level. Instead, it continues to try, spreading its roots up from below and sprouting new shoots by a process known as root suckering. One such quote-unquote younger tree that sprouted this way is likely the oak tree of Phagacia Peninsula, the oak which Phoebe mentions in the Raguna holiday quest. Section 2. Merging into the Roots of Rinacita. So, how do the roots of the great oak in Rinacita's Phagacia Peninsula differ from the roots throughout Jinzhou? Firstly, there are fewer of them than in Jinzhou. Secondly, they are pulsing with this dark purple-blue light. Is it just a lack of consistency done to add a different flair or feel for the new region? Or is it divergence caused by the introduction of a new variable? In June of 2025, we had a new major city release, Septimont, where we see both types of roots. Normal ones, similar to those at Jinzhou, and glowing ones, similar to those of Raguna. The difference between these roots? Their location. The glowing roots in Septimont are placed in regions with concentrated Threnodian power due to past dark tides, such as the Border Mountains. While other places, such as the areas directly northeast of the Border Mountains, the Titanbone Expanse, contain roots of natural constitution. There is even a massive network of roots below the city of Septimont for the underground quote-unquote flight challenge. We thus begin to see divergence based on a new variable, the Threnodian. Now, I feel like I am missing a key line from some part in the Ashen Crypt, but I didn't record it. Something about dreaming or communing with the Sentinel when touching the roots next to the small pool near the first ghostly blade. If anyone remembers that or has it recorded, please feel free to drop it in the comments below. Consistent with this Threnodian variable root hypothesis is the new version 2.5 Fabricatorium of the deep area below the sea. Based on the rock formations, these are closer to Septimont than Raguna, which should generally have normal roots, and yet these contain that pulsing dark blue-purple energy throughout. Why? Because the Fabricatorium of the deep is saturated in the Threnodian's power, just like the Border Mountains. If the Threnodian is the variable, what then does that mean for the roots? Are the roots just soaking up the power present in each region to purify the world? That is a definite possibility, and one that should be explored further. However, I believe it is more than that. The introduction of the Threnodian power into the Rinacitan root system was purposeful. Let me explain. Long story short, the great oak tree's roots were once healthy and devoid of such blue-purple dark energy, much like Jinzhou's root system. However, a certain event led to the introduction and merging of the Threnodian with the tree, and thus the root system. I believe this merger had to do with the Threnodian's original plan to bring the lament, and thus we must trace it back to its earliest form and its believers. The symbol of the Oak Heart High Court itself is a highly fish-like hippocampus, or kelpie, coming out of a great oak. We have been told twice now, first in the Transgressor's transcript, and second in the History of Rinacita, excerpts 1 through 3, that this fish-like creature was a different deity than the one the founding Thessalias worshipped, which was the celestial steed. Additionally, it is a far cry from the current image of the merged Threnodian sentinel, looking more akin to the Leviathan's form. This may potentially suggest that the Vagatia Peninsula is the origin place of the Threnodian, where it made landfall, so to say. As aforementioned, we learn from Phoebe and Reguna Holiday that, again quote, in ancient times, the ancestors of Rinacita discovered a sacred shrub growing in Oakheart High Court. It grew from the roots of a grand oak at the court's center, its fruits a rich russet. End quote. This shrub is likely the precursor of the viscum berries we see dotted throughout the High Court. Now, viscum is the species or scientific name of mistletoes. Mistletoes are parasitic plants and require an injury in a tree as a point of entry to take root and begin parasitizing the tree. Knowing this, her subsequent line becomes pivotal in this theory. Begin quote. Legend has it that it was on that magnificent oak tree that the sentinel inscribed the very first oracle. End quote. Obviously, the divinity didn't do it itself. The so-called sentinel got its followers to wound the tree, a perfect spot for the mistletoe to begin merging into the oak tree. This is explicitly confirmed in the Codex of Holy Rituals, found after collecting all of the Vagatia Peninsula torn pages. It reads as follows, begin quote, The New Codex of Holy Rituals, Chapter 5, Verse 2. Chapter 5, Verse 3, they, referring to the so-called Imperator, desired to deliver the oracle, and so they inscribed the sacred words upon the oak tree, and from the oracle the first viscum berry did grow. 5, Verse 4. The berry is the essence of Imperator's wisdom. Partake of it, and your eyes shall be opened, that ye may discern between good and evil, and hearken unto its precepts. End quote. These booklets are full of interesting lore, but we will just focus on these two verses for this theory. What we learn is that the supposed sentinel did have its followers wound the great oak, carving into its bark, so that this species of mistletoe could find a foothold to merge into it, producing fruit. What's more, the so-called sentinel then encouraged his followers to partake of this poisonous fruit, to discern good and evil, much like the snake in the Garden of Eden. But I prefer to build my lore theories on in-game evidence, so let's continue. This will all make sense. Firstly, what could this divine oracle be, and does it bear any significance in this root theory? Yes, it does. This oracle likely refers to the declaration that Leviathan and Imperator were once one and the same, as well as the coming of the Blessed Maiden. This was likely made to solidify the Leviathan's position and had little to do with the tree. But what if I said that wasn't truly the first oracle, or at least not the Leviathan's first? There are inscriptions in the shores of the last breath that I believe predate the oracle carved upon the tree. While doing some research on this topic, or more honestly trying to find footage because much of the lore in this game is one click and it's gone, I found a post by NOL who reached some similar conclusions as I have. I will use this post strictly for their translation of the potential original oracle, but invite you to go give that post a read for a slightly different perspective, and to test if my interpretations are off or different from the posters. In the shores of Last Breath, we have three daises, one with what I interpret as trees, not tails like the reference poster, NOL, The second dais shows 3 images of the same fish-like hippocampus or kelpie we see in the Oakheart High Court symbol. In fact, the Oakheart High Court crest appears to be an overlay of these trees and hippocampus or kelpies. The final dais contains what I believe to be the true first oracle that inspired the oracle on the oak tree, and that was so kindly translated by NOL. It reads as follows: mistletoe, island, to fish, horse. This oracle may seem rather odd. However, it is exactly how the Thrunodian managed to incorporate and take over the root system of Rinacita, a stark contrast to the undiseased roots of Jinzhou. The Thrunodian delivered an oracle to its believers, those worshipping the fish-like deity, to carve into the tree. Partake of the mistletoe on the island to fish a horse. The to fish here could have 2 meanings. One literally is that the Thrunodian is using this method to fish the horse sentinel, or imperator, from whatever figurative sea it is in, perhaps the etheric sea, in the heavens, who knows. Alternatively, it could have the figurative meaning of to fish, which is to find or discover an idea. Considering the second, the oracle could then more smoothly be translated as partake of the mistletoe to discover the sentinel. While I lack the solid evidence on how the Thrunodian and the mistletoe are connected, let's briefly entertain the thought that they are, since the Thrunodian appears to have ordered this infection of the oak tree with the mistletoe. But why would the Thrunodian go through so much effort to merge into some silly old tree and root system through this mistletoe infection? That is where my theory takes a deep turn into the realms of dreams, the Thrunodian's root of attack. Let's enter the Somniore. Section 3. Connection to the Somniore. Now, it might seem odd of me to bring this next topic up when we were talking about trees and roots, but stay with me for a second. We know through past elusive realms, which no one can access anymore, that the Somniore is a place that collects and processes dreams from the realms we live in. When we arrived in Rinacita, we found the white cat, and it mentioned that Rinacita was cut off from the rest of the Somniore, and that it was veiled by an unknown force. What's more, the cat points out 3 specific subregions: Phagatia Peninsula, and at its end, and to a lesser degree, the Salio Fells. Why is this of interest? Because those are the places that potentially have the most Thrunodian power in history, assuming my theory regarding the origin of the Thrunodian Leviathan's landfall, that is. But the cat spoke of Dreamscape Nexus and Nightmare Echoes. Neither of these have direct connection, visual or stated, with the root system, save that the roots are in Phagatia Peninsula. The connection between the roots and the Somniore instead come from the Somniore painting in front of which the cat is sitting, the same painting that was used for past co-op Somniore battle events. This is the same painting that is part of the overflowing palettes dotted throughout Rinacita. However, the palettes are wrapped in the same tree roots that we see in Phagatia Peninsula, the roots with the pulsing dark purple-blue light, the Thrunodian's power. This series of connections led me to believe that the Thrunodian hijacked the root system, and thus Rinacita's Somniore network, to slowly drain Rinacita through the Somniore. Not only that, the Thrunodian has been repeatedly cited as connecting to the people through their dreams. Remember how Phoebe mentioned that the viscumberry and drinks brewed in barrels crafted from the oak tree's bark, the source of this area's root system, helps individuals commune with the so-called sentinel? One such famous drink is Gocce di Divino, which Brant told us at the very start of this Rinacita journey would let us rendezvous with the sentinel in our dreams. Sunny later confirmed that Gocce di Divino is aged in oak barrels from the Phagatia Peninsula, the same Gocce di Divino that we drank. I will go into more of what this means for the potential history of the Thrunodian in another video, but for now it is sufficient to know that this drink, coupled with the viscumberries and the tree-centric rituals that Phoebe mentioned, are clear indications that the Thrunodian was using aspects of this root system to commune with its faithful, or or yet to be faithful, in their dreams. For those it could not turn with misleading promises, it tormented nightly with nightmares through the system, such as the plight of the transgressing Phasalia household. Once having fought for the integrity of the Sentinel, they were evermore watched and controlled. Likely for more than 19 generations has this family been subject to this nightly, heinous torment, all while quietly bearing the responsibility to preserve and fight for the Sentinel's revival. But I heavily digress. The roots are connected to the Somniore because the Threnodian uses the roots and the fruit of the mistletoe diseased tree to facilitate its communication with the people of Rinacita in dreams through the Somniore. After all, what better way to unite a people than through a shared dream? Conclusions. So, to summarize my root theory, tree roots may be holding the framework that separates the netherworld, the underground that civilization retreated to during the First Lament, from the overworld that we now inhabit. Additionally, these roots have a deep connection to the Somniore, a connection that the Leviathan Threnodian exploited during its attempt to bring the Dark Tide and Journeying Paradise upon Rinacita. Speaking of the underworld and the Somniore, the CSC scientists in the Aix's Mire were looking for a gate to connect them to underground galaxies. Perhaps this gate is the gateways that are related to the Somniore. Just some final thoughts before we close out this video that didn't quite fit anywhere. After establishing this theory, I was running back through some of good old Jinzhou and found a couple items of interest. First, in the dim forest overhanging Felian Beagle's tactical hologram, we can clearly see a convincing transition from the roots to the petrified trees. This might suggest that all of the petrified trees in the red areas are actually made of the same roots we see throughout the rest of Jinzhou. It's just that the larger, bulkier parts, for some reason, are underground. Not quite sure why. Next, considering the dark purple-blue infused roots of Rinacita, I realized that the dim forest had something similar. Before completing the exploration quest, there are 3 giant core fruit objects spewing toxic spores into the air. Interestingly, the base of these cores look like bark, as if it were an extension of the root system. Even more interestingly is that there are bright red lights infused into it, much like the dark purple-blue light of Rinacita in their root system. Since the areas with heavy Threnodian impacts in Jinzhou are red, I wonder if these have to do with Ovathrax, especially since the spores cause agitation, aggression, in those that inhale them. Much like Leviathan used the tree to spread its false unity, maybe Ovathrax tried to use the tree to spread aggression, and by extension, war. A final connection is that the initial core that infested the central banyan was also mentioned to originate at the tree's roots, much like the mistletoe did in Rinacita. Unfortunately, the plant was left unnamed here. However, based on its behavior and appearance, it might be based on a dodder, Dodder, a parasitic vine-like plant that climbs trees. The seeds on the infected backs are also reminiscent of how, quote, dodder reproduce through seeds, which germinate near a potential host plant. The seedlings then search for a host to attach to, and I assume begin climbing. Additionally, the large core fruits look a bit like flowering dodder fruits. Although these are not spore-producing plants, perhaps it is just a unique effect to help spread aggression, not to propagate. And finally, I'm excited to see what the hunting grounds of Septimon will bring for new roots and trees. I saw briefly in the background of the Augusta Uno gameplay leak what looked to be a pretty massive root system, so hopefully it will offer some more to add to this theory. Well, that's all for today. This video has been an exploration and thought experiment regarding one aspect of Wuthering Waves' deep lore. As, or if, these elements become main story relevant, I hope Kuro Games will work their reveal into the MSQ, rather than expect players to already be familiar with them. This would ensure that all players get a proper reveal and avoid confusion, all while still giving me a sick sense of satisfaction when I get to say, I called it. I jest though. I love the slow burn of deep lore and how it is a complicated puzzle that tests my ability to see the bigger picture before all the puzzle pieces fall into place. If you made it this far, then I can only assume you enjoyed this lore and theory content. If so, please consider dropping a sub and turning on notifications so that you will be alerted when I next post. I post irregularly and infrequently, as I have a full-time job. As a heads up, in addition to lore and theory, I do plan to post a few opinion pieces on the game state and potential fixes. So, slowly, obviously. But until next time, keep those cores fed and stay.
Time to get back to work.